St Giles Files.
Hello again all, welcome to this week's episode of the St Giles Files. This week I'm going to talk about something that I probably should have spoken about a few weeks ago, given that there was a good bit of fanfare and publicity around it at that point. But the idea didn't occur to me until this week, so there would have been a very limited podcast to make on it. So I'm going to talk about the beams in our clock tower, or bell tower if you prefer, and how, well, first of all, I'll introduce them as usual, then I'll talk about a few more objects, again as usual, and then I'll push it out. And what I'm going to talk about today a little bit is how history can attach itself to objects that it has not no business attaching itself to, but less business attaching itself to, I suppose. The reason I decided to do this was because the beams in our clock tower didn't necessarily have a confirmed historical age up until very recently. And this is because up until recently, no one had ever done what's called dendrochronology. So it's, and I'm quoting here, the scientific method of dating tree rings to exact year they were formed. And it is coincidence that this report by Dr Coralie Mills came out just as I was reading about dendrochronology. But it's essentially, you can look at the rings of a piece of tree, also known as a beam, I suppose, or a piece of timber, a piece of tree. You can look at those rings, and based on other tree rings that you might have seen, you can date the piece of timber really quite accurately, even within a couple of years, because you would be able to say, well, X year, let's say 1430, was a particularly sunny year and trees grew well. Therefore, there was quite a lot of tree grown, so this ring was quite big. But let's say 1552 was a really horrible year, so trees grew quite badly, so this ring's quite small. It's a lot more complicated than this, obviously. But you would basically be able to see which rings grew well from which years, really almost interlace your dating of trees. So you might be able to say that there's this 10-year period where trees grew in a certain way with a clear and obvious ring pattern. You might be able to detect that in trees that had grown up into this period, and then trees that had grown from this period. So you can almost match trees up as to when they had grown based on unique ring patterns. Obviously, this is a very pint-sized version of dendrochronology, so do read into it if you're interested. But yeah, this is basically how it works. So prior to this work being done then, the dendrochronology, we had no confirmed record as to when the timber was from. And as you can imagine, St Giles timber, as will happen, I suppose, with a large building that's been there for yonks, has had many different rumours attached to it. The most prominent one is that some of the timber came from the Spanish Armada. The story being that this timber, the Spanish Armada, when it was swept all around the coast of the UK, a couple of ships ended up in Fife, and from there they were broken up and the timber was brought to St Giles and used in the clock tower. Now, the first pass of this story being incorrect is that the Spanish Armada happened about 100 years after we thought the tower was built. And it was quite interesting. I can't remember what I was watching, but they claimed their floor beams, it was a building down south, the floor beams were from the Spanish Armada as well. So I would wonder if this, at some point in post-Armada history, any old building with old timber was suddenly built from the Spanish Armada. Now, we hadn't been completely able to refute this until 2 months ago, when Dr Mills and her team set about sampling the timber from St Giles, and it really established, according to her, two felling dates for the trees or the timber in question, the winters of 1453-54 and 1459-60, and that all of the timber, pretty much all of the oak timber, came from the Royal Forest of Darnaway. So unfortunately, decidedly not Spanish. The timber itself is really quite beautiful to look at. Some of it is quite uniform. Others almost looks like they've kind of knocked the tree quite hard and it's just split because there are quite significant, I'm doing hand movements here, so they're rather useless on a podcast, but there's quite significant nooks almost where it looks like the timber has naturally formed that way. So it's really, it's quite beautiful timber, but decidedly not Spanish. And so the point of this week's episode is how objects end up with different histories and incorrect histories as to what they should have had, and how we deal with those histories. I was just about to start getting into a discussion on that, but that is not the time in the podcast to be doing so. So let's leave that discussion for later. So as usual, I'm going to push this out to some St Giles objects. The prime one, which people will already know about if they've been to St Giles, and a bit loosey-goosey calling this an object, because it's the 4 main pillars around the sanctuary, which I'll put a photo up on the website. Now, when I first came to St Giles, I was told that these were 12th century by one of the volunteer guides. And I believe it was thought that they were 12th century for a good period of time. And then a Gothic expert came in and said, no, these are 14th century. And that really does fit with our thinking a bit better, because the idea is that the cathedral was completely destroyed in the early 14th century and then pretty much completely rebuilt, apart from some tiny bits of stone. However, it hasn't stopped many guidebooks printing the fact that these pillars are 12th century, and many of our volunteers, when I started, still telling people they were 12th century, and perhaps not taking correction because it's nicer to call them 12th century than it is 14th century, but they certainly still have attracted that idea of being 12th century, and it's quite hard to disabuse the world of that idea. And a little tangent here, I think, just for these 2 objects, because I'll talk about some more objects in a second, or these 2 not objects maybe, as I think pillars and beams can't really be called objects. Anyway, the tangent is that history doesn't stop, and especially with a 14th century building, I was going to say you could be forgiven, but maybe that's a bit too kind. You could be somethinged for believing that all the history was done, we knew everything about it, and that's that. And I think the changing nature of these histories, so like the beams thought to be possibly from the Spanish Armada, and the pillars thought to be 12th century, and then us reorganising our thoughts or challenging or revising our thoughts, shows that history isn't really facts at all. It's our best thinking about the situation. Very similar to science, I think, that you could be fooled into thinking that science is a bunch of facts when actually it's just our best estimate or our best theory at the time which prevails. And so we do have to keep revising our history to make sure that we are correct in our thinking. I suppose, that'll do for my brief tangent, because I don't particularly want to turn that into a huge discussion. Just quite a nice thought, I think. Right, so other objects. You will remember me mentioning in a previous podcast the wooden pulpit that sits in the Moray Aisle and is often erroneously believed to be John Knox's pulpit. It's just a 19th century pulpit, unfortunately. There's no Knoxian history to go along with that. And then 2 of my favourite misinterpreted objects, for want of a better term, in the cathedral are the 2 memorials to Montrose and Argyll, which are always referred to as tombs, and neither are. I can again completely forgive why one might believe them to be tombs, especially if you've been to Westminster Abbey and then you're coming up to Scotland, and the tombs in Westminster Abbey do appear incredibly similar to the memorials to Montrose and Argyll, and perhaps that's on purpose. But again, they are not tombs, they are just memorials. So if we aren't careful, history might overtake the factual narrative on these two objects. And similarly, the Thistle Chapel is often thought to be something different to what it is. The usual belief, and this is often from American or Australian tourists who have some diasporal link, if diasporal is a word, we'll go with it, link to Scotland. It's often believed to be the kind of the clan home, so all the plaques which are actually for the various members of the order over the years. They are believed to be different clan shields. And obviously the Thistle Chapel, given the previous episode, is not the clan home. It's actually just for the Knights of the Order of the Thistle. So these are some things around St Giles which is very easy, I suppose, to misinterpret what they are and their nature historically. Very similar to the National Covenant, which I've mentioned before, in almost the public history to differentiate from the academic history. So our popular history probably is a nicer, more common way of saying that. The popular history of the Covenant and the Declaration of Independence in America is that the Covenant has, and the Declaration of Arbroath as well, certainly inform the Declaration of Independence in America. Now, academia has long ago dispensed with this idea, but yeah, it still finds retellings. I mean, I've been told it 2 or 3 times by different people in St Giles. And so I think it's an interesting thought that whilst an object's history can be known by academia or learned people exactly what the object is, popular history has a completely different idea of what that is and can almost be hard to shift. And I think it's worth taking a brief tangent into me speculating, purely speculating, on how these things can come up. And my opinion is that it shows the power of oral histories, whether those be older oral histories or modern oral histories, where ideas come intuitively to the history. So, for example, with the Montrose and Argyll memorials, intuitively they look like tombs, so let's call them tombs. And so that kind of sticks around. Some of the wording of the Declaration of Independence is very similar to the Declaration of Arbroath, and there were Scots around at the Declaration of Independence, so it makes sense that we can connect those two things. Similarly, if you were to walk into the chapel, you would see lots of coats of arms. Clans have coats of arms, therefore this is Scotland, it could well be that. So I think these ideas come out of intuitive histories, and I suppose academia is maybe not as accessible, and these intuitions can seem reasonable enough. So we get these, I don't want to say lazy histories, but possibly, let's say, less rigorous histories that take the place of maybe not take the place, maybe just end up filling a void between academia and the general public. So now I want to push it out as to what this means for us. And in that, what I'm saying is, what place do these intuitive popular histories have in our interpretation or our usage of history? And it'd be very easy for me to say no place at all. That they are factually incorrect. They have come from, again, less rigorous histories where people have filled a void. I'm just repeating myself here, but they're useless. I can make something up about anything and then tell enough people that it'll become fact, so who cares? But I think they have something to say a little bit more than that. For example, the beams in the Spanish Armada, I think that does say something about the time in which that was founded, that the Spanish Armada was such an all-encompassing thing that happened, that whilst the idea that the beams are from the Spanish Armada isn't a helpful one and isn't a useful one because it's wrong, if we take one step back, maybe we can gain an insight into the oral histories of the time and what stories were important because of what stories have stayed around and attached themselves to important buildings and objects. And this is the same for other things in St Giles, that people are looking for crypts and tombs, and so they apply that to memorials which you wouldn't expect to have such a huge memorial maybe to someone who isn't actually buried there. So I suppose what I'm saying is there is some use in errors around certain objects, but we also have to make sure that we are correcting them as well, because it isn't useful to have the Thistle Chapel called the home of Scottish clans, because that enhances the whole Walter Scott version of Scottish clan history and towns and that type of thing. And whilst it gives us an insight into how people view Scottish history, in that it's all clans and tartan, we need to make sure that visitors understand that that's not what this room is. This room has a defined use. Right then, now, this wouldn't be a St Giles Files podcast if I didn't have a shot at the Victorians. And I think we often have a debt owed to us by them for attaching erroneous history to objects. For some reason, whenever I think of the Victorians and their dodgy histories, I'm always transported to one particular place in the National Museum of Scotland, which is there's a small kind of circular, cylindrical room with lots of torture objects. And I remember being told that the Victorians were absolutely fantastic at finding objects, if I'm being kind to them, that they believed were used for torture, and they applied so many different wild ideas of what these objects could be used for and how common they were. You know, the thumb screws were so common and bridles were so common, when actually maybe the medieval era wasn't quite as barbaric as the Victorians would have us believe, and that they have applied their history or their interpretation of the history to the medieval era in a way that was probably perhaps a little unkind. And I think that demonstrates that we occasionally be guilty of the same, where we are applying a much more fantastical version of history to our objects than they necessarily have, or a history that fits with our knowledge or our understanding of a certain era without necessarily trying to challenge ourselves as much as we should. And we are basing our knowledge of history on our own assumptions and our own knowledge without looking for new knowledge with which to base it on. To bring us back to the beams here, what I'm saying is that you can imagine beams being brought from the Spanish Armada. Perhaps it's slightly outside of our history comfort zone to think of them being cut down in a royal forest and just being brought to St Giles. Less glamour, certainly, but maybe, less intuitive history. So really, the summary here is that we have to be a bit more rigorous with our history and challenge things that we're told that seem a bit too good to be true or a bit fantastical. And we have to be ready to accept new conclusions on the histories. And if the story is incredibly fantastical, we don't just discount it and say, well, it's wrong, so we will just forget that. We can then almost look into that as a separate part of history. Why did that become the case? Why was it thought that, for example, the beams came from the Spanish Armada? As a separate historiography, I suppose. And whilst acknowledging that the fact is wrong, take something out of it. And to use the other example or one of the other examples of the Thistle Chapel, to say, isn't it interesting that it's often assumed it's the clan meeting room or whatever it is? Why and how has that happened? And is there anything interesting in it? Right, well, that's been a bit more of a stream of consciousness than usual. Yeah, I think that'll do for this week. Right, thanks, bye. The same postscript here as usual. As you can hear, I am still doing this on my own. And we're still out of action and still longer than we all anticipated. And St Giles is still topping up the extra 20% of our staff's furlough. But obviously we're still making no income from visitors whatsoever. So if you can help out and you have enjoyed the podcast, please do. Just head over to the website. It's really easy. There's loads of donate buttons everywhere. So it'd be much appreciated if you can help out. Okie doke, that's it then. Thanks, bye.